Well, good morning. Welcome back to my version of the daily devotions. We've been away, as far as I am concerned, for over a week and a half now. As you can tell, or maybe many of you already knew, I've been sick with a head cold, the worst I probably ever had, and had laryngitis for the first time ever. I've been essentially 12 days without speaking much more than what I'm doing right now. And for about 5 or 6 of those days, I had no voice whatsoever. And so I've been trying to rest it, trying to preserve my voice since both as a pastor and a professor, speaking is a huge part of what I do. I'm trying to get back into the swing of things this morning. This morning we'll be in Psalm number 81. Last time we were in these, we were reading through the various Psalms here in the third book of the Psalms, looking at their understanding of God's blessings and God's grace on their lives. Psalm 81 begins this way, if you want to read along with me. Sing aloud to God our strength. Shout for the joy to the God of Jacob. Raise a song, sound the tambourine, the sweet lyre with the harp. Blow the trumpet at the new moon, at the full moon on our feast day. For it is a statute for Israel, a rule of the God of Jacob. He made a decree in Joseph when he went out over the land of Egypt. I hear a language I had not known. I relieved your shoulder of the burden. Your hands were freed from the basket. In distress you called, and I delivered you. I answered you in the secret place of thunder. I tested you at the waters of Meribah. Hear, O my people, while I admonish you. O Israel, if you would but listen to me. There shall be no strange gods among you. You shall not bow down to a foreign god. I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. But my people did not listen to my voice. Israel would not submit to me. So I gave them over to their stubborn hearts, to follow their own counsels. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their foes. Those who hate the Lord would cringe toward him, and their fate would last forever. But he would feed you with the finest of the wheat, and with honey from the rock I would satisfy you. And so what we have before us is Psalm number 81, is another psalm from another feast. It was meant to be sung regularly by the people to remind them of either something that's happened in their lives, in the history of the nation, or of God's blessings. In this case, both. And again, it's ironic as we've been going through the book of Exodus on Wednesday nights, how similar this passage is and how so many things that we've been talking about keep popping up in these stories. It's a good reminder that we are to periodically stop and to remember God's goodness in the past as we cry out, maybe even before we cry out for his blessings for now and in the future. We're going to be doing that this Sunday morning at Doorway on May 16th as we remember a year now since we've been able to reopen after the lockdown of the pandemic last spring. God has blessed us. We've been able to be open, and he's been able to bless us in the sense that we've not been required to close down since. We've had new members join this past winter. Our giving is up. God has blessed us financially. Not that we're getting rich, but that we're able to maintain all of our duties, all of our responsibilities, and continue to move forward in spite of the fact that our attendance as a whole is down compared to what it was before the pandemic, and many of our folks are unable to join us in person just yet. And so it's a good reminder that when we stop and think about what God has done for us, that's the God to whom we're praying. That's the God on whom we can count, that we entrust ourselves to bless us yet again. And that's what this psalm is in Psalm number 81 for the people of Israel. It begins with a call to remind us to worship. Sing aloud, it says. It's to be jubilant. It's to be celebrative, if you will. We're to sing aloud to God. We're rejoicing, we're celebrating, we're worshiping him. It's not about what your neighbor can hear or not hear in terms of your quality of your voice. Can you carry a tune? God doesn't care. It's about him. It's not about you. Sing along to God our strength. In fact, we're called to shout for joy to the God of Jacob. We're to rejoice, to remember what he's done and celebrate. We're to raise a song, another command. So we're to sing, we're to shout, we're to raise a song. This time he says, and part of the command is to sound the tambourine. Now, don't think of tambourine in terms of 1960s musical instrument where people stand up and sing Kumbaya or whatever. A tambourine in the Hebrew sense here is essentially a handheld drum. It's a wooden hoop with a skin drawn across it, maybe some cymbals with it as well, but it's meant to be beaten with your hand, the fist or the heel of your hand, as you essentially play the drum. So sound the tambourine the sweet lyre a stringed instrument along with the harp. Blow the trumpet at the new moon. The trumpet announces the coming of the king at the full moon on our feast day. And so we're commanded to worship, and then he gives us cause for why. For it is a statute, he says in verse 4, for Israel, a rule of the God of Jacob. He made it a decree, so it's a statute, a rule, a decree. Notice that 3 again. When he went over the land of Egypt, presumably passing through during the times of the plagues. Then the psalmist says in verse 5, I hear a language I had not known. A lot of folks want to get hung up in that and go, is this speaking in unknown tongues or something? It may simply be that they've heard something they've never heard before. It's new to them, not necessarily a new language. In fact, some translations say, I heard a voice I had not heard. It's something new to them, a new revelation of God, perhaps. And here's what God's saying in that revelation. I've relieved your shoulder of the burden. Think of the slavery in the time of the book of Exodus. Your hands were freed from the basket of gathering up the straw for the bricks. In your distress, you called, and I delivered you. God heard their cry. Your hands were freed. They called. God delivered them. He says, I've answered you in the secret place of thunder, perhaps a reference to Mount Sinai. And he says, I've tested you at the waters of Meribah. There's those waters we've studied on Wednesday nights as they were traveling on their way to Mount Sinai when they complained about God. He took them to the place of the bitter waters, and then he made it sweet, showing them who was the good God. His blessings were their source of only hope. He says, Hear, O Israel, then while I admonish you. Think about all that I've done for you. But, hear, O Israel, while I admonish you. O Israel, if you would just listen to me. In other words, they've enjoyed the blessings of God, and they're taking them for granted. They're disobeying him while expecting more. If you would just but would listen to me. Verse 9, should be, and here's the command. This is the command that he heard, that statute, the rule, the decree back in verses 4 and 5. That there will be no strange God among you, that you shall not bow down to worship a foreign God. First command in the 10 Commandments. Now, for them, of course, we know if you've read the book of Joshua, they're carrying around idols, totems, tiki dolls, whatever they are, from the days of Israel being trapped as slaves in Egypt, all the way through the 40 years in the wilderness, all the way through the time of the conquest in the book of Joshua. You get to the end of the book of Joshua, and they're still worshiping foreign gods. Now, today, I don't know that I have to warn most of you about your foreign gods. Most of you don't have some sort of idol in your living room over your mantle or whatever. But remember, a God in anything in your life is anything that you place above God himself. So your God can be you. Your God can be your children. Your God can be your preferences. For churches, our gods can be our traditions, where we'd rather do this than do that, simply because it's what we've always done rather than is it what God wants from us. And so there's to be no foreign gods among us. God is to be the only God of our lives, the supreme focus of our attention and our worship. After all, he says, just like he did at the beginning of the 10 Commandments, here he says it after the command about no other gods, verse 10, I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I'm the one who rescued you. This is covenant language. I've done this for you. Now this is what you'll do in response. And yet even here, even as he's admonishing them, he begs them, if you will, open your mouth wide and I will fill it. If you would just trust me, if you would just make me the center of your world, I'd bless you beyond measure. But verse 11 begins with that little word, but. But my people did not listen to my voice. Israel would not submit to me. We know the story of the rest of the Old Testament. We know they go through this over and over again. But it's also true of many of Christians today as well. God has blessed us. We've sworn our allegiance, and then we put him on a shelf so that we can worship ourselves or whatever else. And then we come back for begging for needs and mercy, and then we go and do it again. So here's what God does. He warns us. They would not submit. They would not listen. Verse 12, so I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own counsels. Sometimes we don't know when it's going to be, but sometimes God says, all right, you think you know better than me, you do it. You go work it out yourself. This verse is reminiscent of Romans chapter 1, where God says he turned them over to the idols of their hearts. Here, he's turned them over to stubborn hearts. He lets us do what we want to do to see if we'll learn our lesson. Oh, that my people would listen to me, verse 13, that Israel would walk in my ways. If we would just come back, if we would just trust him, if we would just put God at the center of our worship, at the center of our lives, at the center of our families, if they would just do that, he says, I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their foes. God often uses negative things in their life to turn us back to him. If we would just recognize it and come back, God would turn those things away. Those who hate the Lord would cringe towards him, and their fate would last forever. But for God's people, the ones who come back, he would feed you with the finest of wheat. Remember, he's already called us to open our mouths and he would fill them. Now he's come back to that refrain. But he would feed you with the finest of wheat, and with honey from the rock, I would satisfy you. Now, is that a reference to the water from the rock, or is that a reference for something else? It's not clear. It's not relevant in one sense here. For us, the picture is God can bless us if we would just bless God. And part of our covenant relationship with him is that in his grace, he blesses us first, but then we respond in obedience second. Are you following God? Are you obedient to him in all things? Or are you really the God of your life? Are you really only obeying your desires? Are you following the stubbornness of your heart rather than the goodness of God's? It's your choice. It can bring you down or it can lift you up. It's true for you, it's true for me, and it's true for our church. Will we follow God, or will we continue to pretend we're the gods of our own lives?